Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in September 2024. And what I'm going to cover is an update of the presentation I delivered a bit early on at OWASP. And my thinking has evolved a little bit, but the content is still super sound. So I'm going to reuse quite a bit of the slides and then add some updates on where we are. But the key fundamental sort of pattern that I'm covering is this idea of making GenAI deterministic. And that's kind of sometimes goes a little bit on the, how a lot of people use GenAI, right? But I feel that it's one of those where the power for me, and I'll cover, is to really focus on making sure that we control the outputs, but more importantly, we also control the provenance, i.e. the history, and we know exactly where data comes from and exactly how everything fits together, right? So, I'm, you can see here, right? Basically, I am, I've done a bunch of stuff. I was a CISO. This is kind of my history. I've done a lot of things on technology. I ran the Open Security Summit. I'm still the chief scientist of this startup, and now I have a founder of this GenAI company called Cyber Boardroom. So my main focus here, in a way, on AI is fundamentally on generative, right, which is a subset. I think we have quite a lot of good knowledge and information about machine learning, and I think machine learning is a different sort of I would say environment where it's more about you create a model, you have a very sort of input and output, and the generative AI is the one that actually creates raw content, which is the one I think is very interesting and I think is the game changer on this. And this is fundamentally is the whole point and premise of this presentation, right? Deterministic GenAI output with provenance, which fundamentally means that deterministic is when it's repeatable, consistent, auditable, predictable, reliable, right? And I know sometimes these are not the words that you use for GenAI, but I think this is super important for us to achieve. GenAI is fundamentally the AI models, this idea that you generate text or generate images. And the GenAI, for me, has a very powerful feature, which is fundamentally the power of creating an intermediate representation and then creating almost a translation from it. And I'll keep coming back to this idea of translation because I think that's quite important, right? And then the output is what gets created, what we give to the users. And then provenance is the other area that I feel is very important because I have to say, coming from security for a long time, I have a big allergic to black boxes. I have a big allergic to magic, to stuff that just happens that you don't fully understand, because every time I saw complexity, I saw things that we don't fully understand how they work. We found security problems, security vulnerabilities, all sorts of basic issues with it. So I think it's very important that the way, I think we need to address a lot of the generative AI content is we need to make sure that we can trace it. We make sure we understand the sources, we understand the lineage, and so where did it came from. I like this idea of provenance, where it's like a graph that you connect all the dots. And that, I think, is super key, because this idea that you have a model and then you just get an output in the end, even although it might be super complex, the creation of it, I'm much more interested in the intermediate steps, right, of it. So here's an interesting question, right? So I asked to the OWASP AppSec in Lisbon this question: what is the 6th most powerful programming language in the world, right? And this kind of were the answers that I got, right? A lot of it, this was Menti, Python, Rust, it's assembly, JavaScript, a lot of them, right? You can see most popular, etc. Now, the interesting thing about this, right, is that, let's talk about programming language, is because data is now code, which is also, quite a problem from a security point of view, but fundamentally a prompt is now code, and all the GenAI prompts are written in natural language. Ironically, the 6th most powerful language is actually Portuguese. I'm Portuguese, so now it happens to be the language that I speak also, but it's fundamentally like this idea that English is a coding language. So the logic is if English is a coding language, which it is now, before you can argue that it was a language that showed intent and defined the business logic. That's how you define what you want to do, and then you codify that. Now, the real power is to actually use English or a language, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Klingon, whatever you feel like doing, right? To describe what you want, actually in terms of code that can then either be executed or broken into bits and then actually execute itself. So basically it becomes a programming language. And Portuguese as English, is can be used to basically define the actions, workflows, and then you create applications on top of it. And I think that's a very powerful. And while I say Portuguese, there's 226 million users, but you can see all the different languages in the world, and then of course there's a difference between spoken. So we actually are ninth, but there's a lot of the difference between the fifth and the ninth is very small here, right? But it's super cool, the fact that you now have all these languages, and even like this is a nice long tail, right? Because you can even have this thing of dead languages or language that didn't have a lot of attraction now can become super powerful language to describe intent in program, right? So fundamentally, there's a lot of new programmers coming along, and on every single language that the LLMs currently or futures provide. So this is one of those where it's a massive opportunity, but it's also very big on what could ever go wrong. Because if you think about it, what this means, it means that if we was basically saying that software was eating the world, there was an explosion of software, there was a lot of code being created. Now the code that's going to be created is going to be multiplied by 100, by 1,000, actually by thousands or millions, right? The code that is actually being created in the world. Now, I think that's a good thing in a lot of ways, but also, of course, going to bring a lot of problems with it, right? And that's something we need to start taking into account, right? So here's I would say, the biggest sort of paradigm shift that I made when I was interacting and sort of learning the whole GenAI workflow, right? Is that the real power is not that it can create content. Yes, it can create, and there's some use cases actually where you can even play with the creativity, you can play with this. But for me, the big game changer on GenAI was that for the first time, we had a piece of technology that actually was able to understand the content that we provided. We were able to understand and make sense of information that we provide in a kind of free flow, in the language format, but is that ability to, in a way, transform data into actual representations. That, for me, is the big innovation here, right? And by the way, the best model that I've heard to explain how GenAI works is exactly that. You take the input, you create these in these models in multiple dimensions, thousands of them across all sorts of parameters, and then you translate what you want out of it. So for me, that's the interesting part. That's what we never had before, right? And in a way, we talk about hallucinations, but you can think of hallucinations are a feature when you want to create content, when you want to be creative, which creative is playing around with different things. And whoever came up with the word hallucinations did a good service, because it's fundamentally lies, right? It's the models that the way they are designed, they don't know the difference between truth and false in most cases, because for them it's just relationships, right? So they don't have that big anchor. So the problem is that although it could be a feature in some scenarios, when you want facts, when you want provenance, when you want to really make sure that you have a high trust in the output of a model, because that's what we need, right? When I talk about deterministic, it's like, I want to be able to trust the output of the models. So to do that, hallucinations is a massive problem. Basically, they are a fundamental bug in the system, right? And just to be clear, right, when we talk about GenAI, when we talk about these models, are they secure, right? And are they safe? And I kind of tend to take the view that security is from a technical point of view, is like how well it's protected. Safe is context specific in where they use. So the bottom line is that, are they secure? Absolutely not. There was a really good session yesterday on threat modeling LLMs. There's a lot of great exploits. The LLMs and the GenAI are probably one of the most insecure technology that we have created in a long time, that we are plugging directly to hostile actors. But can we make it safe? The question is maybe, right? It depends on implementation and the kind of model that we use, which I'll cover in a bit, right? Now, you all use LLMs. How does it really work, right? So let's see in action. And I'm going to show an example on what I'm working on, which is the cyberboard room. And also everything I'm going to show you here is open source, which you can access via the OAS bot repos, which I've been publishing for a while, and it has, a huge amount of models that help this. So it's all in these models. It's also on Pi. It's also on Docker Hub. So you can run the cyber boardroom with a one Pi command, pip command, or you can literally do a Docker run, and you can just run the whole community thing, which is really cool, right? So, and this is, when I went on this path of doing a startup and basically building a new solution, I actually spent a huge amount of time doing something that I always complain on other companies that they didn't do, right? Which was fundamentally the ability to run everywhere. And to do that, I create this pipeline. So I spent a huge amount of time, right? Literally a lot of time fighting Git, fighting Docker Hub, fighting, GitHub Actions, fighting Python, basically bringing it, together in workflows so that I had this very clean workflow that took me from a test to tagging everything, right, to publishing to PyPy, publishing to Docker Hub, and then to a bunch of different places, including creating an AWS AMI, EC2 instance, GCP, Google Cloud Platform. So the power here is I can run this code and basically this application I'm going to show you everywhere, literally everywhere, from a Docker container to Kubernetes to isolation, completely air-gapped, in the cloud, in the data center, everywhere. And the reason that is so important is because for a lot of use cases of LLMs, you actually want isolation. You literally want some of these models to be completely isolated, so you have a huge degree of privacy, a huge degree of protection from user A to user B, because I don't think you can do that in a lot of ways, right? In some of the ways people deploy GenAI models in LLMs, right? So I mentioned every release creates a Pi package, Docker image, Amazon AMI. So again, you can just run the AMI, etc. It's super powerful, and a Docker instance, right? Which is basically what you have here, right? So you can run it there straight away. Now, the problem I'm trying to solve here, which is fundamentally a problem that I think just about everybody in cybersecurity has, is how do you scale risk management and context, right? And this goes down to for me, the big opportunity that we have with GenAI, which is ability to translate content. So what I want to move from is to have these one-to-many briefings where you create one piece of information that you want to convey, and then you have to give that basically the same to everybody. What I really want is to have one-to-one targeted briefings to the individual, to their culture, to their knowledge, to their language, to the state and the questions that they have. That's the power. And that's where we can never do in the past because we couldn't scale this. And now we can. And that's, for me, the power. So the idea here is, how do you communicate with stakeholders? So you want to create, basically these personalized briefings, workflows, and actions. And that's what I'm trying to do with Cyber Boardroom. But again, just take the pattern, right? Like, Cyber Boardroom is just an example of how to kind of do this. But this pattern can be used in all sorts of different places, right? And the technology is there, right? So let's take it for a spin. So you should be able to see it, right? So this is the main one, right? And fundamentally, what you have here is the ability to define a profile, right? So you can basically, and that's the main difference at the moment between this and the community, where you can create a profile. You can, in this case, I say, don't like things too seriously, please reply with humor, wit, and a good level of sarcasm, right? So the idea here is that if you go into here and you say, you say hi, you get a nice message back, right? And this is, we call it Athena. So Athena is basically fundamentally the bot, and you can see in this case, it's friendly, a little sarcastic AI advisor. So at the moment, this is running GPT 4.0, but I can make it run, as you see, with anything out there, right? So for example, I can ask, well, hey, what question should I ask my CISO, right? So now you can see, again, a little bit of humor, right? Some good questions, risk assessment, yada, yada, right? So nice stuff for this, right? I know that's a nice question, but you go hack, how kill you, okay, that's funny, right? You don't want to ask that question, right? But it's a good sort of level of understanding how it flows. So you could say, again, what's my legal responsibilities, right? So now, and again, remember that it knows that I'm a board member because I said I'm a board member. So you have a couple of legal duties, and here they are. And I basically I said that ask with humor, etc. add some emojis. Of course, that I could have said, I have no sense of humor. I have an MBA. I speak this language, etc. So this shows the power of a simple prompt, which what you have here, right? And what I'm going to be doing is evolving a lot of the prompt, a lot of the workflows. So this fundamentally is this idea, and then we have some security content and video. And the whole idea again is to create customized versions of all this. Where I think is interesting for you guys to play with is if you go to community.prod.aws/boardroom, and you can see that I have community.prod.gcp, .azure, I can run this everywhere. I kind of have this this sort of chat with LLMs mode. And what you can see here is you can basically have a mode where you can chat with all sorts of different providers and all sorts of different platforms that you can use. So I don't know if you can see the pop-up, but I'll walk you through. So here supports Grok, which fundamentally gives you free models. You have the Open Router, who has a bunch of free models. The Open Router has a paid bunch of models. You got the Olama, which is really cool. It basically means if I'm running this and I have a local Olama server, I completely off the grid, offline, right? It will also work. You got OpenAI and you got Together AI. So if I go, for example, on Grok, you now look in the middle, you can see I got Meta, Mistral, Google, and then there's also a model from Grok and Open Router. I got tons. I got Graphite, Hugging Face, this is Matt Chumma, the guy who did that reflection ceremony recently, Meta, Microsoft, etc. And then Open Router also has, so those were free, which is really cool. And then there's usually the equivalent of paid ones. Like, look, there's Anthropic, which has Claude 3. You got the Google Flash 5, and there's the Pro 2, and there's the Microsoft ones. There's also NVIDIA if you want to play with, and Perplexity. So Perplexity is quite a cool one because this one actually is aware of, compared to all the other ones, not only is quite good, also it actually has the ability to understand today's time, right? So it actually has real-time knowledge, right, of where we are today, etc. Although it might be, again, for the demo gods, it might be that this one is actually offline at this moment in time. So let me try Claude 3, and there you go. So Claude 3, you can see that wasn't working, but Claude 3 actually was working. So now one of the things that's really interesting about this, right? And you'll see, so this is a normal one. If you look at, and I'm going to clear this, and if you now look at, for example, Grok, one of the powerful things of Grok is the speed. So look at this, like that, look at this speed, right? Now write 10 paragraphs, right? Look at the speed of this thing. That is pretty impressive, right? So there's a lot of really cool things. And basically the idea now, the one of the works I'm doing is figuring out the best model for certain things. What is the best model for certain workflows at the right cost, at the right environment, right? And one of the things I want to show you is the concept of the history. Like when you have a chat with a chatbot, right? And you're basically saying, say, hi, let's say my name is Dinis and I'm in London, right? You can see, look, it says, hi, I'm this, I'm in London. You can say, okay, great. What is, let's say, 40 plus 2, right? And you can go easy math, right? And what the other thing you can do is you could also say, what do you know about the conversation, right? So what you have here is you could say, you could see that the history is kept because, but the interesting concept here is that, the reason why, it knows that my name is Dennis, I'm in London, all that jazz is because I fed all of this. What's interesting is that I actually added this edit button here, so I can now change this information, right? So I'm now changing, right, this information, right, in this case. And then I can now say, right, for example, you can look at this. Let me actually probably change the history too, right? And also the other thing is I'm going to change models, right? So I'm actually going to go to, let's go to, again, Claude 3. And you can see I changed the history. And I'm going to now say, are you sure? Can you double check your answers, right? And then basically what you're going to see now here is you're going to go, oh, hold on, you're right, actually. And you can see he picked up the problem, right? He says, Now he picked up the mistake, calling me Denis instead of Paul, and again, made sure that the correct answer is 42. So what's interesting about this is you can see that the whole history of the model is given by here, which is kind of when I say that what I want is I want to give the model the entire history and play with it so that I start to get the answers that I want, right? And now that we have big context, is actually very powerful. Now, I was playing around with this just a bit before, and actually I there's an interesting one here, which basically what happened was that, sorry, I just want to get out of here. So I'm trying to get into the my thing. There you go. Right. So so what you have here is I did this change again. I Paul, I Steve, etc. But now if you look at this was with Grok, right? And basically when I changed to Mistral, right? What happened was I said, can you double check? Are you sure that the answer are correct? And you can see the answer not, right? So I say, that is clearly not 11, right? And I could also said change Paul, Steve to Paul, right? So then you can see that actually Mistral said I double checked the calculation result is indeed 11. So this is quite an interesting one where you can actually see that we tricked the model, to believe that that answer was correct because the model picked up the result from here. It didn't actually do there. So here's a good example of logic problems with certain models that then you need to understand, right? But then I went to Gemini Flash, right? And I said, can I double check the answers? And then it goes, oh, I made a mistake, right? And also, what about my name? Again, I went to Gemini Flash, and then I changed it again, right? And then I entered Claude 3, and then he finally again gave me the right answer, right? So the point here is I'm showing you the history of all of this, right? Which is quite interesting, and that's basically should give you a better understanding of how does the history work. So when you use ChatGPT, the main one, Claude 3, etc., this is what they do behind the scenes. And I have to say, I don't really like the fact that I don't fully understand it. I don't like the fact that we don't have visibility, actually how the story. There's still a bit of black magic that they do behind the scenes in optimizing some of the stuff, only sharing some of the information, basically keeping the history, but also keeping the number of context tokens down, right? So this is what I just showed you guys. Start with my name, right? And then we can follow up questions again, and then modify it, right? So we change the history. That's what I just show you there. And then, again, are you sure, right? But can you see that it's really cool that I can do the same thread on multiple LLMs, and the reality is that each LLM doesn't know that the answer was provided by a different one. In a way, probably, the LLM thinks that it was created from its history itself, right? So now the other thing we can do is we can speak multiple languages. So one of the really cool things about this is because I spent time developing this control, now we can do all sorts of cool things. So I can, for example, put 6 of them in the same page, right? So what I have is you can pick the model again, like I showed you before, and now this is a really cool workflow where I'm now thinking of what is the workflows that I want to do. So this workflow is a workflow where fundamentally you have one chatbot, which is the main one here, and then I have these 6 independent chatbots, right? And each one has a little bit of a system prompt. So what you can see here in black is literally the system prompt, right? So when I go one paragraph in cybersecurity, this is basically going to send actually 7, it's going to do 7 LLM requests, right? It's going to make me one English, which is that. It's going to give me one in Spanish, one in Portuguese, one in French, one in German, one in emojis, and one in lead speak, right? And also you could see that it was all done by Grok. So also all of this was done by Grok, which is amazing. They're developing a microchip to do inference, so they provide this stuff for free, really powerful models, right? And it's a good example of now you can start to think of this idea that I send one request to one model, I send to other models, and then you kind of, in a second, I'm going to show you how you kind of combine it, right? So that's kind of the power of the simple prompt, right? So you can see here that one prompt goes to multiple languages, right? Which is sort of what I show you this. For example, what's OWASP in multiple languages in here, right? Now, the other thing that's really cool is, let's say that you want to create a kind of workflow, right? So what I've done here was here's a workflow where you want to talk to a CFO, for example, that wants to integrate and ask questions about this. It wants to know, based on the tools, based on the services, based on the budget, right? Give me an analysis. So what you see here, this is all the system prompt that went to this chatbot, right? So, and again, I can pick whatever I want. I can go to OpenRouter, Claude 3, right? So let's keep on Grok. So what's cool about this is now basically not ChatGPT, like the LLM is in what is called interactive mode, right? And what it means that is interactive mode, which is kind of what I kind of describe here, be a workflow, right? Is it basically, you could see that it's being proactive, right? In talking to me, right? So you can see it's almost like it's not me talking to the LLM, it's the LLM talking with me, right? So you could say, I'm here to help you analyze your cybersecurity budget. Let's go simple questions. I said, okay, so let's start. So which AVs do you use? Maybe I say no, right? Use a firewall. Let's say no, right? And then I go endpoint protections, let's say. So now you can see that, if I had says I use AVs and do this, it will go to the next one. Because I'm kind of not using the tools, it keeps zooming in, and you can also provide guidance on which type of tools you want. So let's say I go, CrowdStrike, right? So that's cool, right? So using CrowdStrike as endpoint protection, and he picked it up. Now what services? Let's say yes, managed SOC, right? And then what's the budget? So now it says hardware. So I could now write a detail of my hardware is this, software this, or I can just say actually is 10% hardware, 30% software, 30% services, 15% training, and 50% other, right? And you can see that I'm just interacting with it. So it's much more a nice way of communicating, and he also takes into account my answers. Right. So now it gives me a nice analysis, right? You use CrowdStrike, leverage a budget. So here's now some, information, right? Which is not bad, right? So, so this is where you can do this, and you can even, I can go like this. Great. Can you write me an email to my CISO with this analysis and follow-up questions, right? And then now you get that, right? So now here's an email, blah, 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 here's the information. And then based on this, right? And now you can see there's a bunch of questions, right? So what's really interesting about this is like, the way I look at it is that it should be making the communication between different providers, different players much more effective. Now, in this case, is somebody doesn't have a lot of security experience talking to a security professional, and the security professional should like this because it can now provide much more detailed answers. But ideally, the answer goes also in the kind of LLM format where there's a lot of evidence behind it. Although the answer might look simple, you didn't have a huge amount of evidence behind it. So in this example, it was kind of created by this sort of chat-based environment. But what we could also do, I'm playing around with, is the idea of creating forms. So I change the prompt, so to say, act like a developer, only reply in HTML, and then I put the HTML in here. So, and now imagine a world where you don't even see that. You just see this bit here, you see this UI, right? And then you can see that the experience is a lot easier, right? Because now what I have is I basically just provide, information about it, right? And you got the HTML coming through, right? I think there was a little bug here. I'll just try this again, right? So this is one example where some models provide better HTML, and actually I need to wire this with a new ChatGPT, the tool assist, and then I can really say, give me the JSON with HTML in it. So you can see that he's giving me a bunch of questions, but look at how cool the interactivity is, right? So it's a much nicer experience than just having text. So there you go, there's my analysis, right? And so this is a much different workflow. So now imagine how you can communicate with different players, imagine how you can communicate with different environments. And I feel that these kind of UIs, where the logic is fundamentally defined in prompts like this, will become much more interesting and much more relevant, because you could also take into account who you're talking to. So you imagine like a situation where this UI would literally depend who's on the other side. Again, going back to that idea, I want that UI to depend on the person's language, the culture, the knowledge, the state, their interest, and even level of ownership, who they care about, right? So that's fundamentally a really cool workflow, right, on that one. Now, the other thing you can do, which I put on with, is really cool, is let's say that you want to explore what would board members respond to certain content, right? So here, the prompt is basically this, right? Talk to 3 board members, where you have board member 1, which is no patience, is focused on efficiency and action results, for little tolerance for lengthy explanation, right? Then you have the board member 2, which has some experience and actually hired a CISO. So you can see that it's more of a friendly one. And then you got one that's jaded and sarcastic, is characterized by a high-level sarcastic, completely jaded on security. And also, just to make a thing, they also don't like it, and they really don't like the board member who hired the CISO. Again, remember that there's always this kind of politics sometimes. So what's cool about it, if I send this text, right, this email to it, I can now see the type of answer, the type of answer that, sorry, I pressed back, the type of answer that I would get from the 3 board members. So the one with no patience says, look, I have no time for this. What I need is a clear, concise explanation of the threads. Give me a 1-page summary, bottom line, etc. So this is quite cool, because, this is exactly what happens in the real world. Right? This is a little more friendly from board member 2, and the other one's like, oh, another thrilling presentation about hackers, blah, blah, blah. Right? So it's quite interesting, because what you want is you want a message for each of these, right? And then even if you go, for example, and paste all of these, so let's say now I'm going to use this, right? So I'm going to send this nice, beefy message, right? To this, hi, blah, blah, blah. So you can see it's a much better email, right? Who has that? Now you get still a little bit of an answer from these guys and say, oh, I don't have time to wait through this. What's the risk? What's the bottom line? What's the top 3 things? Anyway, you could see, like, it's not as brutal as before, because it was quite a nice email, but it's still, for the first one, it was still not there, right? And this one, again, okay, fine, I don't know why, blah, 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 but you could see, it's, you need to make sure you customize your experience to each of them, right? And that's what I think is the power, where you can start to create different messages for each of the board members. And of course, in this kind of world of cyber boardroom, right, you're also going to, not only this can help the CISO or the exec, this will also help the, what's it called? The, the other side, the board member, the exec, to communicate and consume the information, right? So there it goes both ways. So that's this example, board members, and then are the 3 exec personas. And then there's another really cool proof of concept I have here, which is fundamentally where you start to have this flow of where you for example, say, okay, let me ask a question and say, what is, let's say, GDPR, let's say, what are the GDPR legal responsibilities, right, for a UK board member, right? Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to send the same question to 3 different models, and then I'm going to ask a 4th model to review it, right? So this is the kind of workflows that we're really doing. Look at how fast it was, right? I'm using Grok. So you can see, in a way, I got 4 different answers, right? And this is where it gets interesting, because I actually now want to see how good they are. So I'm now going to create an Uber sort of prompt. And this again shows you the power and the size of prompts that you can have. So the new prompt is fundamentally this: archive content review. Here's the answer from chatbot 1. Here's the answer from chatbot 2. Here's the answer from chatbot 2, 3. So all of this part here in blue, that's all the prompt that I sent to the 4th, right? And there's the review, right? So you can now see the information is good, good, good. So it gives me good information, right? So so in this case is the most comprehensive, the best choice, right, on that. So you could also pick inconsistencies or pick information, right, etc. So this is, for me, one of the key workflows that you want to be doing, where you start thinking of your LLMs as kind of basically a graph on it, right? And I think that's the real key thing here. So that's what you got here with 3+1 LLMs, etc. right? And I'm going to now fly to some of these, but like, again, bring your own content, right? So one of the questions I had here is, who's me, right? Like usually they really get this wrong. Like literally most models make up ridiculous stuff, right? So again, I review it. Now what's cool about it is that I did the same thing. I said, review on this, right? But then what I've done was I copy and pasted my LinkedIn info, and then the review is way more correct, right? So what's cool about it, so if you think about what I've done was I asked 3 LLMs a question, which I know they hallucinate quite badly. In this case, who am I, right? Then I gave it the reality, and then I start to get really good information about that, right? And that's kind of what you want, right? So you want, let's say I want to give you one summary about this individual, whatever, then it becomes a much better workflow when you can then have 3 answers from 3 different LLMs. And the logic would also start to be that if they, agree on it, you start to have a really solidity answers. And that's how, in a way, you get deterministic outputs. You get deterministic outputs when you can basically ask the same question to 3 different LLMs with the same base information, and then the information actually, you reach a level of agreement on the 3 models, etc. Right? So that's quite important. One more little example here. I really like the sort of what the F is this, right? So a lot of board members receive this kind of graphs and stuff like that. So what you can do in Athena, you can go in there, copy and paste an image, right? And in this case, I actually said, don't take things seriously. And then basically, here you go, right? So basically, you can see that this is an analysis of that, which is actually quite cool, right? So it's almost saying, hey, I received this, tell me what it means. And also, you can also say, actually, can you give me an email to send my CISO about asking this? So now you can see that you start to get really good answers, right? Are we seeing any patterns? Backups are slacking, time to give a team a nudge, right? And then, part of the report was cut off, blah, blah, blah. See? So, this is a really good example, again, of the kind of workflows that we can now do, especially given the fact that the LLMs can understand images, which is really freaking awesome, right? So going back to the main topic of the presentation, right? You can now see some good examples of how you do deterministic kind of Gen AI outputs with provenance, right? And the provenance is when you start to explain where things come from. That's the area that I'm still doing a bit of experimental research, because I want to make sure I can visualize a lot better all of the outputs, right? And one of the topics I want to cover quickly is this idea that, from an attacker point of view, the Gen AI is actually your most vulnerable API and your most dangerous insider threat, because it's a ridiculous black box. And what I mean by this is that a Gen AI fundamentally is an API that you expose to the outside world that at the moment we really don't have a lot of good ways to protect it, because code is data, right? And and I have a pattern I'll show in a second that it's also crazy dangerous if you connect it to the inside and you allow it to learn, right? But the good news is that from a defense point of view, I'm very excited about what we can do in cybersecurity, because for the first time, we're going to be able to actually use Gen AI to understand reality. And I mean by understanding highly complex stuff that you can then use the Gen AI to create intermediate representations and analysis. Again, going back to that initial idea that I'm not using Gen AI to create content, I'm using Gen AI to understand content, right? And then we can automate tasks. Also, we can personalize the communications, which I was talking about the cyber boardroom, but even insanely powerful, we can personalize the learning. A lot of times, the challenge with a lot of teams is how do you learn? How do you teach? How do you let your team members scale the knowledge that they need to do a piece of work? Now we can create really nice personalized learning paths that really take into account the knowledge that individuals have. And that allows them to become a lot more productive. So, and in a way, although Gen AI creates a lot of challenges, I think it's a piece of technology that really will allow us to really solve a lot of hard problems that we have in cybersecurity, right? And yeah, it's a massive threat, right? So my key principles, if you want to have models that are safe, first of all is use read-only models, i.e. use one of the models that you get from the market, right? Don't create your models, right? And I think, especially on Gen AI, machine learning is a little bit different, but on Gen AI, I really don't recommend you to create your models, right? Basically, pick one, understand which ones are better, and treat them all literally as read-only, i.e. the models should not learn. Fundamentally, it's all about the prompt. That's where the action is. Also, bring your own content. Don't rely on content that exists on the LLMs. You really want to basically provide content to the LLMs and then let them answer the question. And again, those workflows where I showed you where you can then verify it. The fourth one is you should assume that all content and prompts are exposed. So this is almost like typical AppSec, where you want a situation where you should assume that whatever content exists in there and whatever content you give the model, there will be ways, if the prompt came from the attacker, to extract it. We don't fully know them, but there will be. Assume that. So if you go into that, means that the only data you should be giving in the pipeline for user A is data from user A. And then when user B comes along, the only data that should be on that pipeline is the data that existed in the model itself, which it's open, and user B data, right, on that. And finally, double down on AppSec and cyber, because that is really what we all need here, right? And so, a good question here, right? So RAG, so first of all, two questions. So using RAG and fine tuning. So RAG is a way to bring your own content, right? I still have quite a lot of doubts on using RAG with vectors, right? Because vectors is still a bit of a black magic, right? Embeddings, right? What I think is very interesting is the latest stuff when people are using graph RAGs and they're using graphs to collect the data that you then give the content. So fundamentally, if you have a graph and you can be very effective in how you bring your own content, yes, that's exactly what I mean. Because the cool thing is that when in your RAG, and also in your RAG, you take into account all our AppSec learnings, right? Again, be careful. There's already a lot of horror stories of companies who've done RAG and they realize they're exposing ridiculous amount of secrets because they allow everybody to kind of connect to the same RAG environment. Fine tuning, it's an interesting one, right? Because I feel that most of the use cases I've seen with fine tuning, I can do better with good graph RAG. Right, and I still feel that a lot of the fine tuning is just a better prompt, and I think what you're much better off is figuring out the workflows with multiple models and start to see what model you want to do at what moment in time, instead of spending time to customize your own model, right? Because the models are changing so fast, right? In there, right? So again, playing around with is again, what is GenAI bad? Is bad at explaining how the output is created. Right, because it doesn't have, this self-awareness, it lacks self-awareness, right, of how correct the answer is. But what is really good at is understanding and connecting data, personalizing and personalizing, customizing data, translating. So in a way, that's kind of my hypothesis here, right? So, and my premise is don't use GenAI in the bits that they struggle with. Use GenAI in the bits that they're really, really good. Like, this, like if you give ChatGPT and Claude, Llama a bit of source code and say, change this, the output doesn't really hallucinate. It tends to be really, really good, right? So that's a good example of you give it stuff, he understands the map and he customizes it. That's where it's really good, right? And the final step is that you absolutely need to have human ownership of the answers, right? GenAI is just a tool, right? And it's the human ownership, is the workflows that we create. That's the power. And that's why I don't like this sort of black box approach for a lot of things, because they're removing the human from it. They're removing a lot of common sense, right, of the loop, right? On the other hand, just to be clear, right, I think GenAI is going to change just about everything in technology and cybersecurity, right? And in fact, in cybersecurity, like I said before, I think it's really exciting is we can finally tackle issues that were too complex and needed too much code. There's a huge amount of parts of cybersecurity that really don't work. They're ridiculously broken because we never had to be able to scale. And we have lots of point solutions, lots of individual bits that solve a little bit of the puzzle. We can now look at much more integrated ways of doing this, right? And by the way, now is a perfect time to learn how to use GenAI and to be an early adopter, right? Literally, don't miss this revolution. There's a lot of analogies, right? On is this like the internet? Is it like is it like cloud? Is it this combined? I actually heard a really cool analogy the other day, which I think is quite good. Is kind of equating to GenAI is like the invention of money, right? Money, when we invented money, we created a common way to communicate, to exchange value, to exchange production, which really changed society dramatically. So I think that's a good analogy for what the impact that Gen AI is going to have. We in a bit of that chasm at the moment where there's a lot of people dismissing Gen AI. They're thinking it's all hype. Don't go there, right? It's going to be, there's a lot of, again, not very good uses because people are trying to use it to create content. The way I look at it, don't use it to create content, use it to translate content. And it's going to be a massive revolution, and it's still the perfect time to do that, right? The last kind of little thing I just want to cover here, I've done this before, right, is, first of all, this is just one I want to show you where this was the big paradigm shift I'd done was when I saw this, right? And this is when I basically saw the original painting, and then I saw Firefly. There's a lot of examples now on this, where he's able to expand the painting. What I want you to think about this is that what kind of mental model, the basically mental representation of the original picture, the model has to have to make it easy to create the rest. That's the power. The power is not that I was able to create it, is that it was easy for the model to create this, because everything is consistency, which what happens before, the same one here, like the Mona Lisa, the Nirvana, and then that's where you can make fun. You can say, hey, put the metallic on the cake, right? Now imagine this for text. That's kind of, for me, it was like, when I looked at Gen AI, it was like, this is different. This is not just predicting the next word, right? It's a much more interesting internal model of the original prompt, right? And that's the power of this, right? So final quick thing I want to cover here is the kind of LLM workflows that you kind of have, again, to go deterministic and provenance. So that's a very simple workflow. Ask a question, get an answer, right? Usually this is most, initially what we do in the environment. You ask a question, you get answer one. Then for the second question, we put the first answer with the second question, and then we get the answer two, right? What's interesting about this is this actually gets very expensive very fast, because this actually means that if you put your answers and every answer with the next question, and through the LLM, you have an exponential context window, right? So what a lot of LLMs do is this, right? So this is kind of a limited message memory, which what you have an LLM message memory, where when you get an answer, you get a summary, and that's what you feed there. So this is where you start to kind of massage the data, from a kind of a background logic, and then you get there, right? Where I think is quite interesting is when you start to do this, where you take one model, you ask the same model, the same question to three different models, you get three different answers, and then, right, you create a prompt, right, with the original question plus the answers, you get a fourth model, and then you get a consolidated answer. This is where it gets interesting, because you kind of start to get to the point where if three models all agree on the same thing, you probably have a much stronger assurance that is actually the valid answer, right? So this is actually the kind of model, especially now we have free models, and models that are very cheap. You kind of want to start to have this where you kind of, send the same question to multiple models, and then you verify it, and you start to get really good answers from it, right? And then the final cool workflow is where you take that, and then what you do is you create this prompt where you actually ask very specific questions. You say, was that a good answer? Was it good? And also, for example, do you detect anything malicious in here, here, and here? And you create a summary, and then after that, which is kind of like the analysis of the first three questions, etc., then, right, you get you send that to the fourth LLM, right? And sorry, this should be actually fifth LLM, sorry, fourth, fifth LLM, and then you get the answer, right? And that is also the kind of workflow that I think is super powerful, right? Yeah, so well spotted, Michael. It shouldn't, right? Well, it could be, right? Technically, it could be, right? This is where I'm still experimenting. We're like, what are the best models? And also, this is why the cost of the models is important, right? Because what you then have is a situation where, if you then have the three models that you send in, you then want to play around with the cost of them. Maybe one of them is the very expensive one. Maybe the more expensive one is the final one that consolidates the data. So you start to play around with it, right? and basically that connects the dots like that, right? So cool. That's actually kind of what I wanted to present on this one. That's kind of like the sort of the whole idea of deterministic way with provenance, and plus play around with the cyber boardroom. It's available, right? I'm doing a lot of experiments there, and I see you guys in the other sorry, the other Open Security Summit sessions. Thanks, guys.